Jack Daniel's is one of, if not the most popular, whiskey on the planet. The company itself is now worth over $4 billion, and people recognize and choose Jack Daniel's over the hundreds of other types of whiskey available on the market every day. But who was Jack Daniel, and how did he come to create one of the most popular whiskeys on earth? The origin story is unlike any other. Jasper Newton Daniel, or Jack Daniel's story, is so old no one even knows for sure when he was born. Although many accounts agree that he was likely born in 1849, and everyone knows it was in rural Tennessee. Young Jack was one of 10 children, all born to his parents, Callaway and Lucinda Matilda, who were the children of immigrants from Wales and Scotland. Not much is known about Jack's early life. His mother died shortly after he was born, and his father remarried and had 3 more children. Although when his father died in the Civil War, and Jack was technically an orphan, he had already left the family home years before due to disagreements with his stepmother and was taken in by a local pastor. He never married or had children, which was rare for the time, but many reports state that Jack treated his many nephews like they were his own and stayed close to his siblings and their offspring throughout his life. One thing is known for sure, and that is that Jack Daniel started a whiskey distillery, but the details of how he came to learn to distill and even when he started the company are a little hazy. When Jack left home, he found a home with a local pastor named Dan Call. Now Dan's part in this story is quite misunderstood. Many believed for years that it was Call who taught Jack to distill, as he was known for making moonshine out of the church. But now people believe that it wasn't actually Call, but Nearest Green, one of Call's slaves, who taught the young boy exactly what distilling was. While there is no doubt that Jack did work for Call and learned a great deal about the importance of work ethic, it was Nearest who was the distiller on the property and therefore Jack's mentor. As the company has now clearly stated, Nearest Green was actually the first ever master distiller in the United States. And with his tutelage, Jack Daniel learned not only how to distill whiskey, but how to do it exceptionally well. Even though there is little known about Jack Daniel's early life, even less is known about Nearest Green. But what is certain is that the Maryland-born African-American slave did distill and use a specific filtering process called the Lincoln County process. This process used coal to filter water and was widely used in regions of Africa in the 18th century to purify water and food. And when applied to distilling whiskey, it created a specific flavor profile and smooth taste, beloved by all who tried it. When Jack finally made his way to the still, he was immediately enthralled by the process and wanted to learn how to make whiskey. Jack and Nearest began working side by side and taught him the sugar maple charcoal filtering process passed down to him through his ancestors from Africa. It's crucial to understand that the Lincoln County process used by many slaves throughout the 19th century is actually what distinguishes Tennessee whiskey from other variations of the drink, such as bourbon. And therefore, teaching young Jack this very specific way to make whiskey led the way for his own brand of Tennessee whiskey, which would eventually become the most well-known and best-selling drink of its kind. But before that happened, Jack Daniel needed to learn quite a bit more about the trade. Once Jack was successfully making his own Tennessee whiskey, he decided he wanted to make his own money from it. But in order to do so, he had to find a way to sell it. He started taking his whiskey around the area, selling it to local businessmen and farmers off the back of his horse-drawn carriage. It turned out that Jack was as good of a salesman as he was a distiller, and the young teen started making money immediately. By 1861, the Civil War broke out, and although it was certainly tough times for the country, Jack increased his profits significantly by selling to Confederate soldiers that camped out in Tennessee. During the war, Jack's father died as a soldier for the South. Biographies of Jack's life all point to the moment when he lost his father as the catalyst for his desire to create a true career and life for himself with his whiskey. Although he had left home years before, his father's passing truly meant that Jack was an orphan, and there was no going back home again. Jack received a sum of money from the sale of his father's estate after he died, and the stars aligned at the perfect time for Jack to officially begin his business with the money. The estate money, along with what he made selling to the Tennessee locals and soldiers, was used to purchase Reverend Call's distillery. At the time, Call's congregation was unhappy with this decision to make alcohol, as they considered it a sin against God. Therefore, Call decided to sell his business to Jack, and by 1866, the Jack Daniel's distillery was up and running. Once again, the exact date as to when Jack Daniel's distillery became an official business is unknown. While many say that he registered the company in Tennessee, where he began operations in 1866, others argue that it wasn't until 1875 that the company became legal. Either way, Jack's Tennessee whiskey was certainly being made and sold in Tennessee throughout the late 1860s, and everyone considers it the first true and official distillery in the United States. In the early years after the Civil War, slavery had been abolished, but was far from truly over. And as history clearly states, the options for employment for freed slaves was essentially non-existent. But Jack decided to officially hire Nearest Green as his master distiller, a decision that was considered controversial at the time. In 1884, Jack bought a new piece of property on which he would build a much better still and facility than the one on Call's property. Nearest retired at this point, but his sons and even his grandsons continued to work for the Jack Daniel's distillery for the next several decades. In fact, over the past 150 years, there has never been a time when a member of Nearest's family has not worked for the Jack Daniel's distillery. While Nearest Green and his family certainly played an incredibly important role in the creation and continuation of the distillery, Jack's dedication to the business was unmatched. He never married or had children, and it is commonly understood that the distillery was the man's entire life. Jack focused on creating the best possible whiskey he could, and people absolutely noticed. However, before Jack's business could really take off and make it big, a huge obstacle arrived in Tennessee: Prohibition. Many people don't realize that even though Prohibition officially started in 1920, the 2 decades leading up to the new law saw a huge decline in the purchase of spirits. At the time, many Americans were arguing that drinking alcohol was a sin and therefore stopped drinking altogether. The government officials, wanting to appease their constituents, decided to pass a law taxing alcohol in 1906. This meant that even those who wanted to continue drinking alcohol had a hard time affording it. This was a tough time for the distillery in more ways than one. Not only were sales at an all-time low, but their fearless leader, Jack himself, became seriously ill. There are several contradicting reports as to what actually happened to Jack to lead to his death. Some say he got an infection in his toe after kicking his safe, unable to remember the combination, which led to the gangrene and blood poisoning that killed him. But others argue that the story told of him kicking the safe was long before he died and completely unrelated. Either way, one thing is certainly true: Jack Daniel died on October 9, 1911, from blood poisoning. Therefore, he never actually saw his beloved distillery struggle through the taxation and eventual prohibition of alcohol sales. And of course, he never got to see it come through those years and become one of the biggest success stories ever told. Luckily, even though Jack didn't have any children of his own, his nephew, Lemuel "Lem" Motlow, had worked with the master distiller for years and was ready to take the reins. Realistically, by the time Jack passed away, Lem was already running the show. He officially took over in 1907 when Jack's health began to fail, and was trying his best to navigate keeping the business afloat while the anti-saloon movement was doing everything it could to shut it down. Lem had help from his brother Jess, but the brothers had to give in 1920 and stop distilling whiskey as it was made federally illegal. However, they didn't give up hope on Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey, and instead of selling or throwing away supplies, they locked them in a warehouse for safekeeping. And thank God they did. When Prohibition ended 13 years later, Jack's 2 nephews pulled their equipment out of storage and got right back to it. But because Tennessee was one of the last states to ratify the amendment, they moved production to Alabama and Missouri. Unfortunately, they could not achieve the same quality as they had in Tennessee, and made the expensive decision to move back to Tennessee shortly after setting up the new facility. Luckily, Lem dedicated his life to creating the best possible Tennessee whiskey, just as his uncle had, and after 40 years in the business and keeping it alive through Prohibition, the Great Depression, and both World Wars, he passed away in 1947. By the 1950s, Jack Daniel's distillery was bought by the Brown-Forman Corporation, who still owns the business today. Although Jack Daniel's had always done well in and around Tennessee, the money and ideas of the Brown-Forman team would propel the company into a new realm of success. For the first time, they advertised and got many celebrity endorsements. Big names like Winston Churchill and Frank Sinatra gave their seal of approval, which certainly increased sales in the USA and the UK as well. Jack Daniel's became the name in not only whiskey, but alcohol in general. And now, more than 150 years after the first batch was distilled, Jack Daniel's is the best-selling whiskey and fifth best-selling spirit on the planet. To think that the young orphan boy living with a local reverend and feeding his animals for room and board created this empire is almost unbelievable. But that's exactly what happened. Hungry for another fascinating business story? Click on the following video to hear the crazy story about the student who left school and created Dunkin' Donuts.